Good morning, everyone. Yes, we got 37 minutes, of course, officially. Good morning, everyone. Hey, thank you for joining us. I'm Supervisor VaLGITE. Currently, I'm both board supervisors and also on the General Government Committee. And so we have a great panel for you this morning. Just really quick, I'm going to just read where you all are so you know where you are, and then just a quick little blurb, and then we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves and give you a little background history of everything that's going on. So this is Emerging Challenges in Cybersecurity. And in the past 3 years, there's been a 100% increase in cybersecurity incident claims. In 2021 alone, risk insurers paid out claims on more than 8,100 incidents. Legislation enacted during the 2022 session of the General Assembly now requires public bodies to report cybersecurity incidents to the Virginia Fusion Center within 24 hours from when the incident was discovered. This panel will discuss emerging trends in cybersecurity and the challenges facing 9 governments and ways in which they can protect themselves. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. We have Mr. John, what's John's last name? John Harrison. He's the Director of Information Technology, Franklin County, and President of VaLGITE. VaLGITE. Okay. I'm going to let you just get what. And then, yeah, go ahead.
First off, when you're on a con call with this man, it shows up as angry Victor. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I'm John Harrison. I'm the IT Director for Franklin County Government in Southwest Virginia. I'm also, as Victor pointed out, the President of the Virginia Local Government IT Executives Group. And I'm several committees to state security standards and the governor's panel for cybersecurity advisory, all that sort of stuff. Fairly active in all that. Been in public service for, let's see, let me check my BRS retirement. 12 years. I've got 11 more to go, so I got me for 11 more. That pretty much sums me up. If you want to get with me after this, I'll be happy to talk about anything you want to talk about. Like I said, technology for the last 20 plus years, the last 4 has probably been consumed by the cyber issues that we face.
And before I introduce, Mr. Chris Carey, Aliscia Andrews, who's the Deputy Secretary for Homeland Security, was supposed to be with us today, but she's Homeland Security, so the incident that happened, she had to step away to take care of that, so she won't be with us today. But we know she's where she needs to be in this unfortunate time. So Chris Carey here is the administrator for VAcorp, and that's kind of all they wrote there from me. So I'm gonna let you jump on in and just fill in the blank.
Sure thing. My name is Chris Carey. I'm the administrator of VAcorp. VAcorp's been around for, this is our 30th year. We provide insurance and have historically provided it in the traditional sense, property, auto, workers' compensation. We've had a cyber product for about a decade now that we really viewed as window dressing to the product, but over the past 3 years have seen that develop into one of our larger claim generators. We handled about 65 breaches last year across the state.
I'm sorry, we've got noise coming.
Sure.
I'll say maybe.
I see a lot of cord here. They provide a lot of overcome.
Just move the whole table to
Maybe you need to drag that cord.
Does that work?
Is that enough? Or should we should fit the table? Like this. That's what we do. Okay, I think that is actually. So, look at that.
So let's see, this works. Is that better? Okay, good. Like I was saying, I've been handling insurance for local governments for 30 years. I started working with Virginia localities in 1994. Cyber, for us, has really developed over the past 3 years. We've been offering cyber coverage for about a decade, but we've seen our breaches double really They've doubled every year for 7 consecutive years. This year's actually so far taking a little bit of a break on the doubling side, even though we still aren't getting breaches in regularly. So we are been building our insurance product, and now we're in the midst of trying to enhance kind of the risk mitigation piece and offering services that help the locality kind of reduce their exposure. So that's what we've been working on.
Thank you, sir. All right, so we have a series of questions. We're going to jump right in. My goal is to get us to a point where we have 20 minutes left for your questions, okay? So I'm not going to waste any time. It's my job to keep these two gentlemen short so we can keep it moving, okay? Yeah. So the first question, that was probably a bad word, bad choice. First question, what is the most dangerous cyber threats that you see local governments dealing with today?
Oh, dear. Gosh. There are so many, but I think ultimately the problem that we face at the local level is not about local government, it's about our culture. And if you look across this room, how many of you have been in other sessions today? And yesterday, and tomorrow, or wherever it is. Have any of the other sessions had such a small gathering of people in it? I would suggest probably not. To me, that indicates the core problem. People don't want to understand computers. They don't want to understand technology, but they rely on it for everything. And that lack of understanding speaks or leverages into the decision-making process, not just at the local government level, but in even our personal lives. How many of you have teenage children? How many of them have TikTok? Is right. How many of them have any idea what information that should be private is now available to everybody in the world? Next to none of them. How many of them care? None of them. I see the same behavior in the workplace, and it's not necessarily local government specific. It is a lack of understanding and an intentional lack of understanding about their individually personal role in the security of the data that's not just pertinent to them as individuals, but pertinent to the data that they, as local government employees, as an example, are required to secure, and the liabilities associated with that. And to a great extent, I think that really is the core issue that we run into most often. It's not that people don't necessarily care, it's just that we as a society have a culture of just blaming it on the computer. I'll give you one example, and then I want you to weigh in, okay? I used to also do adjunct teaching at Virginia's community college system. And every time I had a class, the first question I would ask is, do you know how to use a computer? And the class would invariably say yes. And that would invariably be wrong. Just because you know how to push the button on the iPhone does not mean you know how to use a computer. Okay? The other thing I would ask, I would put up a spreadsheet, and it would have 10 numbers in it. Every number would be the number 10. At the bottom, I would write sum equals 89. Does that make sense to anybody? No. But out of a class of 25, at least 5 in every class would write that down like it was gospel. Why? Because it must be right, the computer said so. We have a culture where the computer is always at fault, and yet we trust it no matter what it says. That is why cybersecurity is such a dangerous issue everywhere, not just local government. Because the real issue is a cultural, personal issue. It is not, the technology exists to solve every problem. The funding doesn't. But more importantly, the understanding of the issue is lacking.
I'm gonna answer that question from an insurer's perspective, which is a little bit different than from John's. So one thing that's really been surprising to me is when we started providing cyber insurance and started having breaches, we were pretty well thought that we understood how a claim would proceed. We would put our cyber attorney on it, and we thought that based off of the size of the locality, we would know how much that was going to cost. And then we, based off of the size of the locality,
thought that we understood what a statement of work for a forensic team to come in and figure out what happened would cost. So we thought we understood that pretty well. We had negotiated contracts with notification and call center monitoring. So we thought, based off the size of the locality, we knew how much that was going to cost. We thought we knew how much public relations teams were going to cost. So we thought we pretty well knew when you had a breach that if you were Franklin County with, which population, 50,000? Yeah, so with 56,000 people versus King William County, which is 18, that I could tell you that if you guys had a breach about what those services were going to cost, because we could project based off of your population, we could anticipate how many employees you had. So for employee data, if you were a school system, we knew how much student data you would have. We could project all of these things out. So for us it was, what are the variables? So the variables for us would be critical infrastructure, so water, sewer, what type of impact could that have on business interruption? What would happen if a 911 system went down? How would you deal with that? Would you pay for a ransom on all of these variable ones? Because you wouldn't for anything else, right? You'd never pay a ransom for Social Security numbers. So you looked at those variables. Well, we haven't really had any of those. We've had 2 911 systems go down, but that was actually pretty seamless. We had one county switch over to another county, and the 911 system was down for just a matter of minutes. So that was actually not that hard. What has surprised us is we've had 65 breaches in the past 12 months. Not one of the localities has been able to recover any of their data from a backup. Not once has that been able to happen. So we have seen disruption and cost associated with data restoration that we never really anticipated. For us, the challenge, or when you ask what the challenge is, most people think they're on the cloud, and the cloud help. That doesn't do anything in this world. The cloud's great because it's efficient. You keep your stuff on servers that get updated routinely without you having to buy new hardware. But being on the cloud really only relieves you of the necessity to maintain your hardware. It doesn't really do anything else. So a lot of people get this false sense of security, like John was talking about. But data restoration, and for local governments, the ability to actually stay up and running when you're considered critical infrastructure, right? You're essential services. The ability to stay up and running, which means you have to recreate from your environment. You have to be able to recreate from a backup to do that. That's what we've actually seen as being the biggest surprise for us, and really probably the biggest challenge that we're dealing with right now.
I just want to back up what you were just saying.
Data backup.
Data backup. The industry has shifted away from prevention towards recovery. So in the old days, we would really try to harden the network as much as we could. We would tighten up the perimeter. We would do all sorts of things to try to make sure that the bad guys couldn't get anything. The bad guys, and I'm sure this will come up in a future question today, have gotten extremely sophisticated. They're far better funded, staffed, and resourced than any local government, state government, or even in many cases federal governments, including the U.S. So we've shifted away from prevention. That's not to say that we don't try to prevent it, because we do. All those things that we were doing are still pertinent, but we're starting to focus more on recovery. And recovery really boils down to what he was just mentioning, and that is you have to be able to restore from backup. Now, without getting into my architecture, how many of you have heard the term, data's cheap? Just throw it up on the server. It's just a hard drive, right? It's not cheap. The ability to recover that data in the event of a serious breach is not cheap. You have to have multiple copies living in multiple places, all of which have to be replicated in as real time as possible to minimize the loss of data should recovery be necessary. And that all costs money. So every time I buy a hard drive, I actually have to buy 3. One for the system that's that has the data, one for the system that's backing it up, and one for the tertiary backup that's off-site in case the whole government center goes up in flames, right? But how good is the data if you... He pays for that too. And trust me, when that day comes, he's already on my speed dial. And that is true. It is part of our recovery plan to include these guys at the onset of any and everything. I don't care if it just looks wonky to me, they get a call from me. So So that all has to be baked into your philosophy. The problem with that is it ain't cheap. DR, COOP, all that stuff, many of it is business process analysis, but most small to mid-sized localities in particular don't have the staffing resources, depth, or skill set to do a complete and thorough business impact analysis in COOP.
Let me place this. I'm just going to give one example here. Sorry. So I want you to think about how things have changed. I've been around for a while now, so some of you younger folks might not see this, but when you guys wreck a cop car, for us, wrecking a cop car used to be pretty simple. You'd wreck a cop car, you'd send a claim into us, we would give you enough money to buy another cop car. And the cop cars cost, at the time, 30 years ago, they cost about $18,000. And we'd buy a cop car, and then the only thing we had to worry about was putting a light kit on the roof. Now the technology in the cop car, when you total a cop car, almost 40% of the value of replacing your cop car now is the technology, not the car. So you can look at that across the board. So, when you're looking at IT funding as it relates to public safety, well, the percentage of budget that's associated with IT for law enforcement should be higher than it was 30 years ago. Your officers can't operate without their IT, without their computers functioning. When you're looking at how much you're spending per student for schools, how much that calculation is, when I started doing this, there's probably over 1 million laptops that get handed out in Virginia every year by public schools. 30 years ago, there wasn't one. So when you're talking about your per student calculations for school, if you don't think that IT is a function of your per student calculation for education, that's wrong. They can't operate anymore. And now with some of the remote things that are being offered at the schools, it's even more important. So just something to think about.
And I'm going to dovetail on that. I love you, this is good stuff. So you were mentioning IT as a cost of, per car has gone up. So if you're increasing the technology, increasing the number of cruisers, you have to accommodate the increasing cost in the technology that goes in the cruiser. The same is true for the staff that support that technology. How many of us have said, had the same staffing level that we've had for the last 20 years? And I'm not speaking on behalf of Franklin County here. I'm speaking on behalf of VaLGITE, and I hear this from every jurisdiction that I talk to. If you build a new building, and this is an honest question, if you build a new building, is there something in the CIP calculation that says you're going to have somebody clean that building? You're going to have a janitor for that building? You're going to have an engineer take care of the HVAC system for that building? All that's included in your CIP calculation, right? Is there anywhere that says if you hire 50 more police officers, you need to have an IT person help take care of them? That is not a sustainable model.
I think I'm going to hold on to this mic and just... Jeremy? I'm going to call audible here, Jeremy, because we have 10 questions that I'm going to ask these panelists, but this is such a hot topic, and you all will sit out there and just either be amazed at the knowledge and the passion that they have for their subject matter expert areas, but I'm calling audible, Jeremy. I'm going to invite you that if you have a question as you hear them commenting, let's get your questions in now. Otherwise, by the time we get to the end of this, you may have too many questions and really forget the first one because it's so much. So if you have a question during this, and this will be the only panel that's done this, you know why? Because this is the coolest panel that we have in this VACO session, all right? So if you have a question of a topic that they're discussing, please jump in, all right? Just, jump in and we'll get it. Well, I won't use that word, but I'll say I've been on a call with these two, and the three actually, and they can do this all day. I figured they're going to be the two I have to worry about pulling the mic from. So I want to offer right now, before we even get into these, that if you have a question, please just raise your hand. Feel free to jump in because this is a really good topic. Yes, ma'am.
Would you please comment on probably the biggest problem that we have with data breaches is the human component of letting somebody into the system by phishing or whatever? Could you talk about that a little bit? Because that's if we can spend all our money on technology for our county of that device.
There's a lot of components that go into that, and it really depends on where your organization is culturally speaking. But if you just look at it holistically, IT folks, we love to come up with really cool terms. Well, we think they're really cool, but they're usually not. One of them is the human firewall, and that's part of the training program that's sort of baked in these days. So, for example, I have a program that I use to put cybersecurity training in front of the staff at least every 4 months or so, right? And we try to do phishing tests and all those sorts of things so that it's in front of them and it raises their level of awareness. But you're right, the human component is by far the most dangerous aspect of cybersecurity. I can do my very best to secure against the guy that's hitting against our perimeter and trying to get through our firewall, but it's very difficult to stop something when the person who initiated the action was authorized to initiate that action. What did John just say? John just said that if the guy's trying to get in my house, he's got to break down the door. That I can put a better deadbolt and all that kind of stuff on there. But if the person that's letting him in the house has the key, then there's almost nothing I can do to prevent that. There are certain things I can do to prevent the spread once they're inside the network, but that is a fairly porous membrane to prevent them from getting inside, yes. So you have to have a good training campaign for your staff. You have to hold them accountable for that. You have to have good policies and procedures in place that you're enforcing, not out of a sense of punitive action, but out of a sense of liability, because the person represents the organization in more ways than just when they interface with the public. They are also stewards of the data that is in their caretaking. So raising that level of awareness takes time. It's a cultural shift for many people, but it has to be done. Yes. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I just want to make sure we didn't lose track of that human element, which is so often the cause of a problem.
And 73% of all data that I give you is probably made up. But the last thing I read was about 80% of successful breaches are because of internal employees doing something that they shouldn't have been doing or accidentally doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and local governments have kind of the outsized challenge on this compared to, say, a private business because of kind of the nature of the beast with elected officials, and in Virginia in particular, constitutional officers, and how those areas get controlled. So that is really a difficult challenge. What John said is correct, but how you enforce that through with cooperation, punitive or not, maybe funding to follow policies and things like that on the IT side might get overlooked a little bit.
All right, so next question here. What is your advice for local government leaders that are analyzing their current cybersecurity measures?
Get out of the way. Don't be a roadblock to what needs to be done in the organization. And again, when I say these things, I'm speaking holistically about local government in general, as opposed to any specific example. But I would say that I work with all the localities in Virginia on one level or another, and by virtue of having sat in on the development of the Cyber Incident Response Planning Committee for the Fusion Center in response to the legislation and everything else, I can tell you that a lot of the breaches that we had were entirely preventable. Almost all of them are because of misconfiguration or an employee clicked on something or whatever. But in almost every case, there's also what I would consider to be a lack of brave leadership. No one in a leadership position should have a leadership position if they're not brave. You have to be willing to stand in front of people and say, you might not like what I'm about to say, but this is the truth. We have gaps, we have to close them. We have limited funding. Let's do an honest to God risk assessment. Do we actually need another sheriff's car on the road, really? Or do we actually need that fire truck? Or do we actually need the library to have funding for the books? Or you have to be able to have an honest discussion about where the risk to the organization lies and apply your funding against that risk level. Most folks are small, mid-sized like me. I can't sit there all day and do a really good risk assessment about everything. You don't have to go to a 400-page document to figure out where your risks are. Let's just have a sit down and talk and figure out where our risks really lie. You don't even have to document it. If you've got like 10 people in your whole organization, you don't have to document that. You don't have to have a change advisory board and all these things. But you do have to have the conversation, and you have to have a thought-out strategy about how you're going to close those gaps. So my advice would be brave.
I'm going to answer that question to supervisors, not administrators. So for the supervisors in the room, my answer is, so best practice right now on a breach, when you have a breach, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to have legal counsel appointed. So even if you have county attorney, there's going to be legal counsel that gets appointed. In Virginia, that appointed legal counsel gives you an extra layer of protection for confidentiality. One of the things that you need to know as supervisors is if we release information out before we actually know what happened in the breach, the cost of that breach is going to escalate. So one of the things that's difficult for elected officials is you have constituents and you have employees and you want people to have that information, and we want people to have that information. But rarely, most of the breaches we have, rarely do we know what actually was taken at the moment of that breach. So what you think may have happened may not be exactly what happened. What we do know right now in Virginia is that there's only 3 types of breaches that you're dealing with. You're dealing with encryption events, which is about 60% of the breaches. You're dealing with email phishing schemes, which are about 30% of the breaches. And then you're dealing with what are called fraudulent instruction or social engineering cases where you're having payments get directed to outside parties where you think you're actually paying a vendor. That's really the only types of breaches that we're seeing right now. So with supervisors, the supervisors need to be patient to actually find out what happened. You have legal counsel. That means you can deal with it in executive session. You can keep quiet. You can figure out what happened. We can figure out where the data is. We can come up with an answer, whether that's call monitoring, sending out notifications. If it's a HIPAA-related response, that's a different animal. That's harder to deal with the regulatory side. But for a supervisor, my advice on this is to be patient, because it will take a couple of days to actually figure out exactly what happened. And we actually had a $250,000 breach turn into a $40 million breach when an elected official thought it was a good idea to put out an announcement. Because when you get breached, they don't always know whose data they have. And when they find out they have a deep pocket, the value of that breach goes up. So you need to be careful and patient on those things.
And I'm just going to back that up very, very quickly, I promise. I will say that personally, I'm blessed. I work in a jurisdiction that is full of extremely passionate and caring people, and they want to do the right thing every time. I've also worked in other jurisdictions where it was less so. Let's just say there, a lot of politics got involved. Again, I'm fortunate I don't have to deal with too much of that at this stage of my career, but I will say that just to back him up on what he was saying about VAcorp, part of my incident response procedure obviously called in first, but one of the reasons is because we get a cyber coach assigned to us by VAcorp, and I know who that is, and I trust her implicitly. She is extremely talented and dedicated to doing that job correctly. But when I say correctly, part of it is to help us fill our PIO services out and our legal counsel specific to the cybersecurity incident that we're dealing with. So, like, our legal counsel may not have a lot of depth in cybersecurity, but they do, and they're bringing that to bear for us, and they are an integral part of our team because of specifically the PIO services, basically telling us what not to say so that we don't make it worse. Yeah.
Cybersecurity. Be brave, be patient, be quiet. I think this is a very good topic. I love this. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess for a risk assessment, a government entity, wanted to have one. What are the tools? What's the toolkit for that? Is it plugging with VAcorp and setting the wheels in motion that way? What all is involved in that?
Well, let me take a stab at that.
I'm gonna let you say that, I'll start this one.
So, we actually at VAcorp decided to do things backwards. This was a conscious decision. The first thing we wanted to do was make sure that the coverage, the policy that was in place. So we actually went out and stripped down a bunch of commercial insurance policies and figured out what people needed in Virginia based off the type of claims that we're having. So we actually built a product first. And then we've actually backed in to figuring out how to service it. So the next thing that we did is we built our service teams. So the legal counsel, we have all of our vendors. We actually have pre-approved, agreed upon contracts with all of our vendors. So when our breach coach meets with the IT director on a breach, we actually have all of the statements of work already pre-authorized. So those can actually get implemented within minutes. So we can actually get forensic teams on site for you in minutes. It's not like an auto claim where it's not going to get settled for 3 years down the road. Your breaches are going to be over in 14 days. From start to finish, it's going to be done. Now, there might be some backup work on changes that need to be done in the system that take years, but the actual breach itself, to when we send out notifications and do all of those things, is just going to take a few days. So right now, we're actually in the process of building out the risk control or the risk mitigation components of what we're doing. So for us, we actually are getting ready to make some announcements to our customers here soon. But one of the things that we're doing, David, is we have a company that will actually do some continuous scanning and provide the customer with a report on where their vulnerabilities are and why they're vulnerabilities and what they need to do to fix those vulnerabilities. So they'll actually get those reports and get some access to some of that data. And then the other thing that we did is we actually are working with a company that has access on the dark web. It's actually the only company that is authorized by the Justice Department to buy data off of the dark web. So we actually have all of our customers loaded into basically a Justice Department system, and we're monitoring to see if any of your data is being accessed. And then we actually have the ability to buy that data instead of the hacker. So I could actually be buying your data off the dark web instead of a hacker. So we're actually in the process. Actually, we've already loaded that, but that's kind of what we're doing from the mitigation standpoint.
Now, aside from that, there are other things you can do to sort of build out your risk assessment of where you are. There are minimally fee-based and free-based services from the state and federal governments that allow you to do vulnerability testing and things like that at the state, local, and tribal level. So we make use of a lot of that. There are also partners out there that we can engage to help us do a risk assessment and those sorts of things. But in my personal opinion, those are helpful, but really the biggest bang for my buck is not having somebody come in and tell me what policies I'm missing. While that's important, the biggest bang for my buck is having somebody do a vulnerability assessment and tell me what technical holes I have in place. Generally speaking, the non-technical stuff boils down to policies and staff training, in my experience. Aside from that, there's no end of the technical holes that you're going to have to find and close, and that's really, to me, where you need to focus first. Well, not first. I think that perhaps in tandem, just don't forget you have to do both.
Yes.
I just want to speak to a couple of things we went through the process. One thing that helps on the patient's part is the state police come in, take over the entire investigation. You don't utter a word until they clear to do so. Our case is still an open case, so we collaborated after we found out info was involved, personal information was. Then we had a collaborated statement for that. And that's the only statement we've made in 3 years because it's still open. And I'm not a tech-savvy person. Up until last year, I was still having them kill trees and make me paper voter packets. So, but one thing that I can tell you from my experience, you can do this assessment. It's an ongoing thing. don't fall in and say, all right, I'm gonna do this, have this assessment done this year. We're gonna follow that way. That's all we gotta do for 10 years. It's not. It is and take it from somebody that's lived it. It is an every year thing. It's almost twice, 3 times a year that our IT people are coming to, all right, we need to do this, we need to change this. As soon as you get it assessed and you get any protection in place, you're 3 years behind. I found, to me it looks that way. It may not be, but it looks that way to me. And so, just realize we're going down this road. It's not going away. And no disrespect to anybody. As soon as you come up with something that's going to protect us, there's some little fellow somewhere in a little dark room figured out how to get around it. And then you have to come up with another one. So it's a forever thing. That's just all
Well, if I had to say anything responsible, I'd say you're correct. I do at least 2 to 3 assessments every year. And you have to do it constantly. Every time you plug a hole, you have to rescan to make sure you didn't create a new hole. Now that's just the technical side of the scanning. Now, the soft side, you have to continuously train staff about being aware of things, and you have to keep on top of your policies because the policies need to morph and change along with the growth of your organization. So, like one day I might have a 1-page policy, and that's good enough. Next year it may not be a good enough policy. So it's like anything else. Most people are familiar with doing an annual evaluation of staff, right? We build it into our process to do an annual evaluation of every policy that we've got, along with our staff descriptions and everything else. So at the very minimum, we have to look at it at least annually. But in terms of like the technical scans, some organizations, like the free-based ones that I can engage through the state, I can only do that once a year. That's why I pay a little bit to have a third party come in and also do assessments on top of those free assessments, because they find that each of them finds something that the other one missed anyway. So it's always a good idea to have at least 2. Yeah.
Fresh that I know.
Yes.
Yes, question. Do you gentlemen foresee that the sophistication of cyber attacks, will we ever reach a point where we see that we're kind of getting to the top of the food chain with the sophisticated nature of them? Or is it always going to be a fluid nuance that we have to keep our eye on day to day?
It is always going to be a nuanced adjustment to what's going on. I sort of liken it to the trench warfare of World War I. Right? The trenches didn't move, but they were fighting back and forth over the same ground constantly. And that's kind of where we are. We know where the bad guys are. We just can't get to them because they're in protected nation states. And we know what our assets are. So we know where our trenches exist, but the ability for us to respond is critical to our success, any success we've got. It's changing constantly, and for anybody out there that's familiar with the whole Web3 movement, with the cryptocurrencies, the blockchain, and everything else, that's the new buzzword in the IT industry, but the blockchain's been around for 9 years. And most of us have been aware of it, but it's now becoming more of a mainstream technology. And that's not going to change. When that one becomes mainstream, there will be another one right behind it, pursuant to what that gentleman in the back was saying. As soon as you close a gap, there's another one opening. And I don't see that ever changing. The nature will change. And I'll give me one more second. For example, 10 years ago, there was no such thing as, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, crime syndication, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. 10 years ago, when you got hit with a virus or something, you had to fix it and move on. Now, if I get hit with ransomware, the screen pops up and it gives me a phone number to call, and I promise you, their help desk answers faster than mine. And there's somebody there who is technically savvy that will help you figure out what Bitcoin means and how to pay it with PayPal and all that stuff. It is a very well organized, well funded, and extremely efficient business. That didn't exist 10 years ago. If you had asked me 10 years ago, it never would have occurred to me that that was happening. But it is. So if you ask me what's going to happen 10 years from now, I don't have a bloody clue. And the reason I don't know is because I'm not a bad guy. I don't think like them the way I need to. Now, if you want to find out what's going to happen in 10 years from now, we should probably get the FBI in here because they pay those guys to figure out what's going on 10 years from now. The short answer is, it's never going to stop, and you have to build that into your thought process that we're going to continuously have to adjust to meet those needs.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that my opinion about improving that scenario, so right now the response is very disjointed from a government perspective. So when you get to the state level, we have the Fusion Center, but then there's a Northern Virginia Fusion Center. So between the state police, it's not entirely coordinated between the two fusion centers that are the state police. The Virginia Department of Emergency Management has certain responsibilities. The Virginia Information Technology Agency, since local governments tie into certain state systems, is involved. They have a Virginia Data Governance Institute that's funded by the state that's also involved. Believe it or not, the Virginia National Guard is involved in cyber events. That's who has the hardware. So if all of your systems go down and you need somebody to bring in 50 or 100 computers to Franklin County, it's the National Guard that brings it, which doesn't seem normal because that's not what we really think the National Guard does, but they do. So in Virginia, and all of those agencies are bargaining for budget. Those are all silos. So everybody's fighting for budget. So all of those state agencies actually undermine each other when it comes to response because they're trying to justify budget for those state agencies. So it's not a coordinated effort because they're trying to get funding. And then if you go to the next level, which is the federal level, you have CISO with DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and then you have the FBI. So depending on the type of event you have and who's involved, you could in theory have to navigate 7 regulatory agencies to actually get something done. Now I told you that your breach is going to take a matter of days. Is there any government that you've ever interacted with in the US that you've been able to navigate that quick, let alone 7 agencies? So the problem right now, when you talk about can we get better at this, until the federal government and the state government can figure out how to fund a coordinated effort to provide support, the answer is no. And they're trying to put regulations on you to make things better, but they really need to regulate themselves. They need to change themselves first before they start telling you guys to change. That's actually the biggest challenge that we deal with right now as VAcorp is trying to, that legislation that happened last year was almost a disaster because VITA doesn't have the same FOIA protections that the Fusion Center has as a law enforcement agency. That would have been a disaster if you had to report to VITA. And I'm sure that we'll see some bills come through this year that I'm not aware of yet.
And I'm going to touch on that as well. Just to sort of dovetail it into something that was asked earlier, the National Guard is actually the organization that will do the annual assessments for localities. You have to go through VDEM for that, which is also another point that you were touching on. The context of this presentation is about the challenges that are faced at the state, local, tribal government level for cybersecurity. And while I still hold to my original statement about what the primary problem is, the secondary, not far behind it issue is what he was just referring to, and that is everybody's trying to solve the problem. There's up until recently, I would say there's been very little collaboration across various government silos. That's at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. I will say that there has been only light at the end of the tunnel recently by virtue of the recent legislation that has required 24-hour reporting to the State Fusion Center. I say that because when that came out, not that the legislation was a great idea, I take no side one way or the other on that, but it did force people into the same room, and we are now starting to have collaborative conversations with the state from the local level to try to break down some of those barriers. You know as well as I do as government folks that that's not an easy task and it's going to take forever, but it is the right thing to do. We're talking about DHS and CISA, we're talking about CIS running the ISAC and the EIISAC, We're talking about the FBI, we're talking about the State Fusion Center, the Virginia State Police, we're talking about VITA, we're talking about the Department of Elections. All of these folks are trying to solve this problem, and we need to pull that all together. Not only because it's inefficient to do it separately, it's also very ineffective to do it separately because we are all pose a risk to each other. We're part of the same threat landscape. And as far as the bad guys concerned, we're the same person. We're Americans. Okay? They don't care if I'm Franklin County or whether I'm DHS. All they care about is, can I get your data and can I force you to pay me for it? Right? Now, if you get $50 from Franklin County, that's $50 profit because you didn't spend anything. All you did was write a program where they can attack me, right? Then I can swivel that program over to DHS or somebody else or Fairfax, and I get $500 million from them because they're bigger. That's still 100% profit. So you don't think that you're safe because you're small, because to them, you're just an IP address that represents potential cash in for whatever dollar value that is. It's 100% profit. So there's that.
Listen, I know we can do this all day, you know, because I was only question 2, but the best part is that you're asking questions, so we did an audible to really get some real good information for us. And I like the fact that we pulled in supervisors and elected officials because these are real issues that if we haven't faced, we need to really start getting behind this to the point of the protection and to the point of where we're going with this, because we're probably 20 years behind on this right now, so we need to be looking out the next 30 years, which brings to the next question that we've been kind of discussing here already, which is what do you see as the future of cybersecurity? And I'll just pause there because I think that's such a broad question, but you know, I think it covers pretty much a little bit of everything that we've heard here and some of the concerns that you've addressed. Where's it going? What can we do? What should we be thinking about going forward?
I'll go ahead and start this one. Ultimately,
Can you answer this from 2 perspectives? One from a small locality that doesn't have resources, and one from a large locality that might have resources.
I can try. What was the question? Future of cyber.
And I like it. That's what we are making. You know,
Ultimately, I think my answer to that is size independent. But if it's not, kick me under the table. I really think where we're going in terms of cyber is at the government level, it's going to require legislation and mandates. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because nobody likes to be told what to do. Local governments are independent. But ultimately, we all represent a risk to taxpayer dollars if we don't take the appropriate actions to secure that data. And I'm not a fan of legislation or mandates, but I can't wrap my brain around a solution that leaves it up to each basically individual to meet a certain level of compliance standards unless we come up with a funded set of mandates to get us there. We have opportunities like the state local cybersecurity grant program, which is being kicked off now nationwide. There's obviously visibility on cyber at the government, the highest tiers of government at this point. My concern is that over time, if your governor changes or if your president-elect changes and their advisors change, the focus will shift to something else and the funding will move with it, which is why I'm sort of in favor of getting to the point where we come up with some sort of well-defined, well-audited, truly assessed threat landscape that is representative of all entities in the fabric. That means every local government, every tribe, every state entity, and we measure against that commonality and we leverage the funds against that as a group. Meaning, and this is just me talking, I don't like grants. I don't like grants because they're not sustainable and it puts localities in a competitive position where the small government is competing against the large government. And depending upon who's reviewing that grant, they can say, well, the small government needs it because the large government has money and the small government doesn't. Or you could get a different grant reviewer that says, well, the local government, it's a terrible submission, it's only 5 pages long, it doesn't have all these check boxes that I want to check. Whereas the larger government has a body sitting there checking all those boxes that knows what they're doing to submit a grant. I don't think we're ever going to be successful if we remain in a competitive funding model for cybersecurity. We need to get into a collaborative model where we are sharing our data in a secure way so that we can get an accurate threat landscape across the entire, in this case, Commonwealth, and leverage the funds against that risk model.
Yeah, I had a meeting with the state police a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about that. You know, one of the benefits of VAcorp is we can aggregate data. So, you know, the state police was surprised to find out, like, we know where all the dams are. They're trying to figure out where critical infrastructure is. We insure all the critical infrastructure. We know where all the dams are. We know where all the convention centers are, or all the stadiums. We know where all the sewer and water treatment plants are. We know all of these things. And even on the cyber side, when we first started having these meetings, you know, once the cyber event abates and we've sent out the notifications, you know, if there was some standardized mechanism to code cyber events nationally, and we were able to take our data and code that and see where the trends are nationally, so you could see if there are issues that are different in Virginia because we're so close to DC as opposed to California, which isn't close to DC. Our local government's dealing with different issues. We could actually start tracking that. It would actually give people the ability to allocate resources correctly. Everybody's so worried about funding their silo that nobody's actually looking at those issues. And if you could actually come up with some standardization on this, and I hate using the word mandates around local government officials because that usually comes accompanied by the word unfunded, and nobody wants to talk about unfunded mandates, which is usually how this stuff works. But if there was a way to actually aggregate this data and use it in a way that would be productive, you could probably make some headway on it.
And that is how we will win. I'll give you an example of how you lose. I enjoy history. I'm particularly a Vietnam history, but also World War II history buff. Most people are unaware, but it may not surprise you that Nazi Germany had an atomic energy program looking for the solution to the atomic bomb. Who knows that? Did you know they did that? Are you surprised? I mean, come on. They had the best scientists at the time. So why did we win? Why did we get the bomb first? Anybody know? Not that that was a good thing, but why did we get the bomb first? Because we took the silos down. We put all the right people in a room, no matter where they came from, chemists, metallurgists, physicists, and we said, solve the problem. The reason Nazi Germany didn't get the atomic bomb first was because every one of his departments had their own atomic energy research program because they all wanted to make him happy. Okay? And they wouldn't share the results because they didn't want the other department to get the favor of the Fuhrer. Did you know that their postal service had an atomic energy program? Nazi Germany's postal service had an atomic energy program and had a stockpile of weapons-grade uranium. It was found after the war. It got mislaid because somebody got lost and dropped the truck off at the wrong place. But that's why we won and they lost. They lost because they did not tear down the silos and communicate effectively and collaborate towards a common goal.
All right, good history for you there. All right. I'm going to go a specific question to both of you gentlemen, and I'm going to start with you, Chris. What is unique about cybersecurity risk insurance and response?
So, cyber breaches are different than any of the other type of losses that you deal with. So when you have an auto accident, most people know that there was an auto accident. So when you report that auto accident, there's a lot of people in the community that probably know that it happened. So there's a specific process that everybody's kind of familiar with when you have an auto accident, right? You call your insurer up. It's okay if you kind of talk about it. You don't admit fault right? You never admit fault, but you kind of know that it's there. So if a building burns down, people are going to see that your building burned down. On the cyber side, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes with it, and nobody knows what happened when you have a breach, and what you think happened is likely not what happened. So there's a lot of coordination of effort that goes into it, but there's a lot of cost that doesn't really get anticipated. So if I were to ask you right now, what is the biggest claim? So what's the average size of a property claim in VAcorp? Anybody have a guess? It's about $13,000. Our average workers' compensation claim is about $8,000. Our average automobile physical damage claim is probably $3,000 or $4,000. Our average line of duty act claim is about $350,000. That's the biggest claims that happen in local government in the state. Nobody probably knows that, but the biggest claim you will ever have as a locality is a line of duty act claim for a public safety officer. Number two is cyber. So the average cyber claim is going to cost about $150,000. So that's on average. So there are cases that are going to cost much more than that. But if you are, particularly on the county government side, which is what this conference is, we started giving you cyber essentially for free. We gave you a $500,000 limit years ago. We let you buy up on it, but there are very few localities. There's probably fewer than 10 localities that if they had a massive breach that created any liability at all, any third-party liability, let's say your 911 system goes down, you can't get it back up, and something happens, and you get sued because of that. The cost for everything, the liability, legal fees, forensics, public relations, all of those pieces is likely to be quite a bit more than $1 million. So a lot of localities think that, there's localities that are buying $20 million of automobile coverage. We have most of our localities buy $5 million of liability coverage, auto, general liability, public officials. But all of those average size claims, the average size of all of those claims is thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we have a lot of localities that look at cyber and they say, well, the $500,000 that you give us for free, that's enough. Or the $1 million, that's enough. I'll buy $1 million, that's enough. I'm telling you right now, if you're a locality that thinks that you need to buy $5 million worth of auto coverage, you probably need to think about cyber and whether or not $500,000 or $1 million would be sufficient if you're a locality that thinks that $5 million is what you need on the other side of things. It is not likely that a major breach, and I would say we've had maybe 2 major breaches that we've seen. It's not likely that you could handle a major breach for under $1 million. So if you have less than $1 million or less of cyber coverage, it is not likely if you have a major breach. It is enough to handle the average breach. It is not likely enough to handle a major breach for the vast majority of localities. We do have some smaller localities with really low populations where it probably is enough, but it is probably not enough.
More good information. All right, John, what role do you serve in protecting local governments, the Commonwealth, from cyber threats? I think we pretty much heard that.
You had to ask me that. Well, we're running out of time, so I want to, like you said, I want to leave enough time for people to ask questions. But the short version is that's a small, mid to large size government. I'd say small to low, small to mid-size government. We don't typically have CISOs, we don't have ISOs, we very, very, very seldom have even security analysts. So the role of securing the network falls on folks that don't necessarily have that in their immediate skill set. The large government entities, I'll say like the Fairfaxes, the Chesterfields, the Virginia Beaches, the ones that have a large tax base, do tend to have a security analyst and staff which means that the IT director and or CIO can do their strategy development and things like that, and then rely on those folks to handle it. But the mid to small size governments typically put that on the IT director, along with any other number of hats like procurement officer, or the person who helps the finance department. And I'm just saying this because I've seen it happen. I was just talking to a locality on the western side of the state last week, and I couldn't get the IT director to engage. He said, I'm offline all this week because I have to do budget for the board session. It's like, you spend that much time on your budget. It's like, no, I got to do it for the whole county because our finance department doesn't have anybody to do that. So when we're talking about IT departments, they do tend to be the catch-all of whatever nobody else wants to do, or what nobody else knows how to do, or what nobody else knows how to make the computer do. So that to me is part of the job. You do what has to be done, but ultimately the large organizations have staff for that. The mid to small size organizations don't. So it falls on usually the IT director to try to develop not only the risk assessment for what's going on, but to develop the long-term strategy of how to mitigate that. I will say there are partners out there that you can engage for that. VAcorp is an excellent partner to help sort of wrap your brain around the risks associated with it and what your appropriate level of coverage would be and those sorts of things. There are state and federal entities that you can partner with to help develop strategies. Those typically include the FBI. Your state FBI office will help with that. You've also got access to the Fusion Center, but less in terms of strategy, more in terms of instant response. Then you've got DHS and CISA, which is an excellent resource for the development of a long-term strategy.
Yeah, for us, it's really, our role, VAcorp's role, really outside of the insurance, is really to just try to identify what's going right or wrong. So we actually, and John hasn't even seen this yet, but last year, well, we actually came out, last year we set out a survey. We've got about 540, 50 members in the group. We set out a survey, so we actually think we know what 10 questions to ask a locality so that we can provide them with some advice. Most localities don't want to answer those 10 questions because they think we're going to use it against them to either raise their price or deductible. So we're actually dealing with some of the challenges right now, but we actually think that we know what 10 questions can move the needle, that if we can get the answers to these questions, we can aggregate it and then provide resources. And then if we look at the size of the localities, we can put those responses together and then put recommendations together based off of the size of the locality for them to be able to move the needle. We didn't require our members to answer those 10 questions last year. We got about a third of them to respond, maybe a little more than a third of them to actually respond to a voluntary survey. And I don't even know if we're going to ask all 10 questions when we do our renewal this year. We might just ask 5 or 6 of what we think are the best questions. But really what we're trying to do is provide that resource. So our ability to aggregate that data and be able to share it with the members and give them solutions to the problems is really kind of where we fit into the puzzle.
And I will say, in addition to the duties that are assigned to me as an IT director, in my role as the president of VaLGITE, much of my work is involved in trying to get other localities to actually answer questions like that. Part of the challenge that we face, obviously, is nobody wants other people to see their dirty laundry, right? But we're not going to solve this problem if we don't bypass that and figure out a way to trust each other a little more and figure out ways to secure the data so that we can develop that level of trust. Which goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the light at the end of the tunnel with some of the most recent things with the state. I would say out of my 12 plus years of government service thus far, this is the first time I've seen this level of collaborative discussion with the state about state local requirements. So I am hopeful that this continues.
So ladies and gentlemen, because this has been an interactive process, we have about 7 minutes. Are there any questions that anybody has that want to ask? And I have one. I'll ask them if you guys are good. Maybe this will spark a question from you. So my question involves social media. So in what ways has social media made local governments more vulnerable to cyber threats?
Well, I'm sure that my colleague over here has metrics and stats associated with that. I'll just give you my gut reaction, and that is, don't share things that don't need to be shared. And I know that that goes contrary to the concept of transparent government, but transparent government never intended for us to put things out there that are not necessarily ready for consumption. I want to be able to provide as much data to my citizens as I can about what I'm doing with the resources they've entrusted me with. On the other hand, there is data that could pose a risk if it falls into the wrong hands. That means that your organization really should give some consideration to the development of a data classification scheme. I don't know many local governments at all that have a data classification scheme. If you can't go back to your office right now and say, this email contains this type of data, this is this level of classification, you don't have a data classification scheme. And without one, it's very difficult, almost impossible for you to expect the end user to know what they can safely share and what they can't safely share.
Yeah, actually, this is an area where we don't actually have any statistics. So most of our cases are not really emanating from social media. Most of our cases are really a major effort to try to encrypt a system or a server. So we're really, the majority of what we're dealing with are encryption type events. I think social media, what John's talking about is right, but you know, how social media is contributing to the problem. I don't have any social media, so I'm not watching what any of you are doing. I don't have any of it, but so it's hard for me to really comment on that. But I would think that you would want to have some sort of mechanism or some sort of policy for what you would want to release on social media.
And I'll just tack on to that. I mean, let's be honest here. My network guy's probably not going to put our firewall config on Facebook, right? So I'm a little less concerned about that. But there are things like when you post an event up on Facebook and you tell everybody where all the sheriff's deputies are going to be, well, that's also telling them where they're not going to be, you know, so that kind of stuff. So there is a risk posed with some of the things that you share. But from a cyber perspective, unless you have a truly misguided individual, or even worse, someone who's got a grudge against the organization, you probably don't have to worry about them putting out your whole IP scheme and what your firewall config is, but who knows? You should still have a policy saying don't do it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, for our last 3 minutes, I'm going to take us out with a song. No, I'm not going to do that. I am going to take this time to thank, our panelists here, John and Chris. I learned more about cybersecurity just in this short session, but not just cybersecurity. Like, I really didn't know a lot about VAcorp, and I definitely didn't know a lot about, and don't let me say it for you, VaLGITE. So, and I definitely have learned that you two really have a relationship. Y'all work together, and this is good. And they work together on behalf of all of us throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia on areas that, true enough to your first point, when you look around the room, we should all be taking this seriously. And I think this would really be something good for the general session when we get out here to sit up and really have this discussion, because it's not that we don't want to know about this, but I don't think we take this as serious as we should be when it comes to these data breaches. And I don't know much about this, but I heard what happened with the Bitcoin and the breach there and money missing there. And although we don't know a lot, maybe you all do, but I just think the IT world and technology is so in-depth, and there's a lot there that we really should be taking a better interest in it. Even listening to this dark web thing, I have no idea what the dark web is, but it's real. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on with it. An organization that has money to buy back our data off the dark web to give it mind-boggling. But I imagine that this really exists, and we're really doing that, and we should pay more attention to that. Really, I'll stop there, because like my two panelists, I too can talk. But I do want to say on behalf of all of VACO and the folks in this room that want to hear this topic, thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here and educate us and keep us well informed on cybersecurity. So thank you.